6 out of the 9 classic World of Warcraft classes can tank in Season of Discovery. So I leveled each and every one of them to 25, geared them up and raided with them. 1, because I deal with crippling existential dread by playing WoW, and 2, to find out which tank you should play. I want to know if these classes are actually real tanks and are truly capable of withstanding the torrent of angry DPS trying to snatch aggro away from you, or if they're just able to tank on paper. I'm going to rate these classes based on a few factors like threat, survivability, how fun they are to play, and with phase 2 just around the corner, we're also taking a look at the future and their potential moving forward. Shamans have always been at the very forefront of potential tanks since their introduction. They can wear a shield, have threat modifiers on a few spells, but due to how the game panned out, they never really got the chance to actually tank, until now. So the big question is, can they actually? Yes. Holy shit, yes. For only being level 25, Shaman Tank offers a surprisingly engaging gameplay. There are so many buttons to press, from spells to totems. Their taunt is only on a 6-second cooldown, which is a huge deal when all bosses can be taunted. Plus, it deals damage and interrupts, as well as separating the cooldown away from other shock spells. Because basically all of the power in Shaman tanking comes from the Way of the Earth rune, it allows your build to be extremely flexible. There are so many ways you could build this class, and all of them would work out. If you want insane single target threat, you can easily just dual wield and run Lava Lash to pump damage. Or if you just swap Lava Lash to Molten Blast, bam, there's your AoE spec. If you want to play more defensively, you can equip a shield. If you need to regen mana, there's different choices depending on what weapon setup you run. It's extremely flexible. Plus you bring all the bonus utility that a normal Shaman offers with totems. All this lends itself to Shamans being able to build around basically anything. If you want to go slow, if you want to go fast or generate threat, or survive. Plus, them being basically the only tank with a reliable multi-target threat in the entire phase makes Shaman the all-around perfect tank. There are 2 slight downsides. Is 1, reliance on mana. Of course there are runes to offset this, but you are trading an increase in power for the ability to regenerate resources. And 2, their overall damage done is very low, the lowest out of any tank at the very top. Looking at the next phase, I can't really tell exactly how it's going to play out, but as I said, because all tanking power is centered in a single rune, I have no doubt Shaman tanking will remain extremely flexible, and with them also getting their own version of Salvation, Horde will no longer have to struggle as much with threat as previously. I can confidently say that Shaman is an S-tier tank. Warrior has traditionally been the go-to tank in all of Classic. Their threat and DPS significantly outshines any other tank, and in a game where boss damage isn't all that relevant, being able to output a lot of threat has always been king. But even when considering this, Warriors have never tanked as actual protection, instead opting for something called Fury Defiance and mostly dual wielding because of how insanely well it scales with gear and world buffs. With Season of Discovery though, this is changing. The introduction of the Burning Crusade spell Devastate gives warriors a legitimate reason to equip a shield and keep wielding it. So with so many tanks being added and others being buffed, can warriors keep up? Yeah. They can. The key difference between Warrior and most other tanks is that they rely on Rage, and because Rage generation isn't normalized in Classic, it means they scale insanely well with gear and buffs, alongside having 0 downtime because they never have to regenerate any resource. Because Devastate deals weapon damage and can proc Wind Fury, your initial threat and DPS can actually be quite insane, and sometimes topping the meters for extended periods of a fight. Of course, your AoE threat is basically non-existent. The Thunderclap rune is extremely weak, and the extra 10 threat it generates is nothing compared to the output your DPS can generate. But it's actually quite important to note that in relation to other WoW expansions, where you have 1 or 2 tanks taking all the enemies, in Classic you never AoE tank. The way to deal with multiple enemies is just to simply assign a warrior to each target, and your main tank to bosses. So the relevancy of being able to AoE tank is questionable, especially considering that most warrior DPS actually want the mob to hit them a little bit for the extra rage. even more so now that the trash deals such an insignificant amount of damage. Warrior is also the tankiest tank. Due to Maelon always wearing a shield currently, they take the least amount of damage out of any. Now of course we have to talk about warriors essentially being a one-button class right now. Pressing anything other than Devastate is mostly extremely bad for threat. But the genius at play here is the introduction of Consumed by Rage. This rune forces you to manage rage in a way that you never had to before, and prevents you from mindlessly spamming Devastate at all times, instead making you focus at keeping your rage just around 80, never going too high or too low, which adds just enough flavor to the class to actually make it engaging to play. There's also some variance in the builds you can run depending on how good your gear is. You can run more DPS oriented or more threat oriented. Warriors are already scarily strong, and with the upcoming capstone talents, new runes which look extremely promising and fun, they're not looking to fall behind anytime soon. Also, there are some runes motivating warriors to go deep protection next phase, and even more power while wearing shields, so it'll be extremely interesting to see how it plays out. Warriors are, and will probably always be, S tier. Warlock is an interesting one. In Classic, there have been times where Warlock has tanked, but it mostly boils down to standing at range while wearing a lot of resistant gear, casting Shadow Bolt. Most of the Warlock tank fantasy came from the introduction of Metamorphosis in Wrath of the Lich King, which gave Warlocks increased armor and a bunch of new abilities. This didn't actually manifest in any Warlock tanking though, but it's this fantasy that they carried into Season of Discovery. Now I must say, Warlock was one of the classes I was most excited to try. Aside from the other SOD changes, Metamorphosis adds 5 new spells to your kit, on top of all the changes to your stats. But unfortunately, Warlocks are just kinda weak. Their main threat generator is Searing Pain, which turns instant during meta. The problem is, the next rank of Searing Pain is locked at level 26, which means you are stuck with the weakest version of yourself in this phase. To offset this, you have to run all the fire damage boosting runes, and while this does almost increase your threat output to acceptable levels, it requires setup before pull, a ton of mana, plus reduces your flexibility significantly, requiring you to fight enemies inside your Rain of Fire pool. The armor increase puts Warlocks around the level of warriors in terms of physical damage reduction, but without the chance to parry or block, as well as having no extra dodge due to agility not being a main stat. Now this wouldn't really be a problem until you factor in that life tapping is very prevalent thanks to just how much mana you spend keeping all the dots and fire damage buffs active. The coolest thing Warlocks have going for them currently is the ability to instantly pull enemies from range, only locked behind a global cooldown. This sets them apart from every other tank in the game, and can be quite powerful as it lets you start building threat before DPS can even reach it. On top of that, in Classic it's extremely common to have a hunter move ahead and pull enemies to the raid to reduce downtime and add a certain amount of control to how you face enemies, which you are now able to do yourself as a Warlock to a lesser extent. In the next phase, there are many runes tying DPS and survivability to critical chance, as well as the introduction of Immolation Aura and Shadow Flame to substantially increase your AoE output. Looking at the numbers, I'm not sure this is quite enough to offset the increase gained by other classes, but with the introduction of Salvation, threat might not be such a pressing issue. Warlock is such a different experience and plays unlike any other tank, and that's why I hope they manage to make it viable moving forward. But right now, due to lacking survivability and threat generation, they're a solid B. In TBC, Druid bears received 3 key changes. The introduction of Mangle gave them an upfront threat spike akin to Bloodthirst or Shield Slam, which helped massively with initial threat on bosses and enemies. Lacerate gave them a way to sustain threat on longer fights and a spammable rage spender that wasn't tied to their auto attack. Swipe got an attack power scaling, allowing it to be used to get multi-target threat reliably. In Season of Discovery, Swipe does not have an attack power scaling, rendering it completely useless. Mangle and Lacerate are on the same rune slot, which means that compared to the 3 changes in TBC that made them dominate as tanks, you now only have 1. So, this is what your average action bar looks like. The leg rune slot is essentially dead for bears, only offering a measly interrupt, and tank damage reduction rune is on your chest, which is also where Wild Strikes is, meaning that you can never use it, as not using Wild Strikes would eliminate the reason to bring a feral in the first place. Lacerate has also been remade, providing less initial threat per application, instead scaling incredibly well based on how many stacks you have on the target. This is good for boss tanking, as in TBC, Lacerate became almost redundant at 5 stacks. But this means your threat on trash or enemies that die fast is absolutely abhorrent. Coupling this with the low rage generation, plus a lot of things just straight out taking you out of bear form, it makes feral druids just a worse version of warrior in every single conceivable way, aside from bringing wild strikes. But this is actually a big aside, or it would be if cat DPS wasn't actually pretty strong right now. Thanks to Lacerate, boss threat is not even close to an issue. You cannot lose threat even if you tried, aside from the first boss of course, which is completely immune to bleeds. I mained the feral druid in TBC and really liked it. The flexibility of going CAD if you need a bit of DPS, the huge upfront numbers of mangle, and the general utility of a druid made it very fun to play. Sod tanking is nothing like that. It feels slow, the upfront threat is terrible, and having a completely dead rune slot sucks. You can't even utilize the rest of your druid kit because shifting out of bear is so extremely punishing for your rage, and you run out of mana in seconds doing anything else. Although, looking at the upcoming runes, it does appear that they are maybe separating Mangle and Lacerate onto different runes or something along those lines, which would massively increase the bear experience. Even still, the new runes are basically half of what warriors get or already have, meaning that so far, there is no reason to not just play warrior instead. The only reason why bear tanks aren't F tier is because they have reasonably strong sustained single target threat and are somewhat tanky, putting them in C. Just don't play them right now. Make a warrior. But hey, at least it was quick to level, only took 12 hours to get to 25. You might be wondering how I got all these classes to level 25, and with phase 2 just around the corner, maybe you're looking for a bit of extra help. Rested XP offers insanely detailed step-by-step leveling guides, including runes for Season of Discovery. Levels 1 to 22 are completely free, so you can cover basically most of phase 1. And if after trying it out you want more, you can use the code JAMPANOS for 5% off. Click my link in the description if you're interested. I was a bit cautious coming into this and looking at rogues, because unlike the others, the tanking rune offers very little survivability. There are other runes you can pick to somewhat rectify this, but it leads to the big problem of what avoidance tanking means. Avoidance tanking has generally never been favored in WoW because your job as a tank is not to sometimes avoid damage taken, it's to consistently avoid damage taken. If there's a 90% chance you dodge all damage and a 10% chance you get one shot, it's going to be a terrible tank. So unless rogues become borderline immortal by hitting 100% avoidance cap, which is a huge problem in and of itself, I'm a bit worried about the viability of rogues surviving. But aside from that, rogue actually shows some potential. There has never been a tank utilizing combo points before, and with a big mix of combo finishers in terms of offensive and defensive, balancing that is quite fun. Energy as a resource lends itself very well to dumping tons of threat in the beginning of an encounter, which is a very strong tool for any tank as it's when the threat is most volatile. And no reliance on mana means you never have to stop. Single target threat is good enough that my rogue didn't really have a problem tanking basically freshly dinged in a group full of BIS warriors. A big downside of rogues currently is of course that target swapping is made difficult by combo points, and the fact that you are extremely resource locked by energy ticking at a constant rate. This means there is a set amount of time between every attempt at getting threat, so anything above 2 targets is close to impossible. Again, the importance of this remains to be seen, because right now it doesn't matter one bit as long as you have a couple of warriors in your group. But sometimes enemies do run onto the range and healers and you'll have a hard time picking them up. In terms of DPS, rogues are also up there with warriors, which is promising for their potential speedrun capabilities. Rogues also have an extremely strong defensive cooldown in evasion that's up every 3.5 minutes, which is actually quite often and lasts a substantial amount of the duration of a fight. No other tank has something like this. There are no huge defensive cooldowns in Classic, except like Last Stand, so this is actually quite important. All in all, despite my concerns regarding survivability and multi-target tanking, I see huge potential in rogues, both from a viability perspective but also that they're just
badass.
And all of the issues I've talked about are seemingly already getting rectified. You'll be able to swap combo points from a target with a baseline spell, you'll get 30% health from dodging and parrying, increased energy generation, plus AoE abilities. That's literally everything I wanted, and hopefully this means rogues have a very bright future ahead, and because of that, I'm putting it in A tier. Paladin was the last class I played, as being unable to extort my guild into letting me play freshly dinged tanks wasn't an option. But let's be honest, looking at what Paladin gets, I already knew they were going to be good. The tank room gives you access to a taunt, increases threat and eliminates mana issues, which is a huge deal. You have some of the strongest runes in the game considering what other classes have available at this level. And your setup plus playstyle is incredibly flexible. You can literally run any of the 3 talent trees and they each have their own strengths. Holy gives you Consecration for extended mass AoE tanking, Protection gives you higher threat generation and hit, which is great for more consistent boss tanking, and Retribution gives you Seal of Command, move speed and lower judgment cooldown, which enables some very strong two-handed tanking. Plus, no matter what spec you picked, you still have plenty of customization with runes. Divine Storm with the two-hander's insane multi-target upfront threat only rivaled by Shaman Molten Blast, but if you want easy consistent threat you can run Seal of Martyrdom, and Avenger Shield can easily be swapped out for Exorcist for a little bit of extra single target threat. You can swap between two-hander and shield without sacrificing too much threat, and having access to mail makes you generally tanky. The pace of gameplay is also great, you're not limited by any resource other than cooldowns, so you can slam incoming enemies and bosses very hard on initial impact, giving you enough of a threat lead to sustain yourself until most enemies die. Running as Retry single target threat could be a bit random, sometimes you get 50 procs on your first auto and never have to worry about aggro again, or you get 10 parries in a row. When a class has this many tools this early on, it can literally only go up from here. And while Paladin do have lackluster capstone talents, being able to double dip into any of these specs will most likely prove extremely beneficial. No matter if you're Horde or Alliance, you can rest easy because you each have one S tier tank. And yeah, that's that. Go download Rested XP using my link and the code JAMPANOS. Thanks for watching, see ya!